Preface to Miscellaneous Records of a Female Doctor. Our ancient land has birthed many famous doctors, some of whom were female. It is the honor of our family lineage that my cousin, Lady Tan Yujian, has produced a book of some heart-mind, life-saving cases. The great physician Sun Xingxiao wrote, "Women are 10 times more difficult to treat than a man." This is not just a matter of yin and yang or of the outside world of men and the inner chambers where women reside. It is because women become pregnant, give birth, and endure monthly loss of blood. They also suffer from having different temperaments and emotions than men. My cousin has excelled at treating women because she has shared the losses and joys of what it means to be a female on this earth. Written by Ru Lan, Metropolitan graduate with honors by Imperial Order, Grand Master for Court Precedence, manager of the Royal Lancers. Hey friends, it's me, the Ebony Otaku, the well-rounded nerd. So I'm coming back with another women's story out of Asia from one of my favorite authors, Lisa See. And we are going to explore the book that I just dropped. Her novel, which came out this year, Lisa See's Lady Tan's Circle of Women. And let me just start by saying you have to read this. When I started reading it, well, for one, it was Lisa See. I saw it on the bookshelf. I was like, oh, she wrote a new book. But when I picked it up, make sure you have time to read it, because I think I finished it in a day and a half. Like I could not stop this book. So if you're gonna pick this one up, it's a good one. You need to make sure you have time. But as always, we're going to read an excerpt from the book and we're going to talk about some things. Now, I'm never going to read an entire novel on here unless it's one of those that is out of, that's in the public domain. Something like, a Charlotte's Web, some of the Dr. Seuss stories, things like that. Otherwise, I'll read excerpts from books and then we'll talk about it. Copyright be a thing. But I also, when it comes to literature and reading, that's one of the loves of society that is being lost because it takes time and patience to read. I'll be honest, the reason I had time to read this, and I'm reading another book of hers right now, The Village of Sea Women, the reason I was able to read it is because I had surgery and had to sit down and do like light activities, and reading is a recommended activity. I don't typically in my regular life have time to sit down and read a whole novel, so books on tape and the like have become very popular in the modern world. But if you have time, make time to sit down with a book, really get invested in it, into the characters. It's one of the great things about having the book in your hands, that flipping back and forth. Like you read something and go, oh man, that was great, and you go back to it. Like I've got pages folded down in here of just amazing sayings that I never want to forget. One of the lines in here that I just thought was so amazing, as you get deeper into the book and they're talking about women of different statuses and what women go through. Our main character is given a chance to go actually treat someone in the royal palace at some point with women's medicine. I'm trying to find the best way to say it because we got a lot to talk about with this book. But they actually say, I am looking down for the right words. One second. Found it. So this is way into the book, so we'll get context around this later, but just listen to this writing. Like, ooh, it just goes so deep. A grandfather offers this guidance. Even if the patient is the emperor's favorite concubine, don't forget that she is no different from any other woman, 10 times more difficult to treat than a man. Only someone who's been married as long as my grandmother would have had the audacity to bat at her husband's sleeve in dismissal. First, at the idea that I'd be called upon to help someone so exalted, and second, because of her intolerance for that ancient belief. Her eyes sparkle as she speaks the basic truth. A woman is a woman, whether born in the dirt or on silk. That's profound. A woman is a woman, whether born in the dirt or on silk. And that is at the heart of what we're going to talk about with this book. I'm only going to go through part of the first chapter today, and I'll probably take another video to finish up this chapter. But we're only going to go through the first chapter because this is one of those stories that is just so important to read. But before you read it, some things. So let's level set. Again, we're in ancient China. We're in the 1400s, medieval times in this book, which incidentally, in wrapping up my degree, one of the last courses I had to take was one more elective, and I had to take a medieval history class. And one of the questions that was asked on my final paper was whether or not anything not Europe counted as medieval. We were specifically studying the Spanish invasion of Mesoamerica, and then also looking at what happened between Europe, the Arabic countries, that part of Asia that reaches into Europe, and then, on into Asia, the gold roads and all that with the spice trades and whatnot. Do they count as medieval? Well, yeah, it happened during the time period. And medieval more than represents a period of time. It represents a period of cultural stabilization. So let's do a little bit of a history discussion before we get into this. And just gonna let you know, when you go into this book, that look at me and my eyeballs. There are a couple of points in this book that when you get into it they're gonna make you mad. They made me mad reading them. Very well written, nothing distasteful. Let me be clear, nothing in this book is distasteful. It's just honest. And when we talk about medieval culture, when we talk about pre-industrial culture, one of the things I learned through my medieval history course was part of the problem with a lot of societies back in the day, and during that portion of human history, was that there wasn't that established social expectation of behavior as thoroughly ingrained as it is today. Now, our cultures have all been around for hundreds, thousands of years. We all know how we're supposed to show up in the societies that we're born into. But we have to remember, this is the time when those things are being established. And we actually took time in the course to specifically focus on Asia, mostly China, because it's China. But why did Chinese culture develop the way that it did? And China had a huge problem pre-medieval period with people just misbehaving. People did not know where they belonged. And we also have to remember that there's a lot of warring clans at this time going for full control over the land where all of these disparate tribes, nomadic tribes, people live, to unite the land into what would eventually become China. China is the largest nation on earth, landmass wise. For a long time, they led everybody in population as well. India, I think, is about to beat them out in population, but still physically the largest country. As the warlords are taking over, they're realizing that because the cultures of these individual groups are so strong and so different, they have to be able to unite them somehow. You can unite people because you told them to, because you've got all the soldiers and you sent the soldiers and your soldiers make people behave. You can unite people through religion. Look at Europe. You can also unite people through cultural expectation and philosophy, and thus introduce Confucianism, which is a philosophy. I would not call Confucianism a religion, but it definitely is a philosophy and way of being. And in Confucian philosophy, everyone has a purpose and place in the home with their own family, but also responsibilities defined to outward society. And it's very clear what everyone's supposed to be, what everyone's supposed to do, how you show up in the version of the world that you go into. Because everyone from the view of the top down, emperor down, was quote unquote lost, the emperor in Confucianism, he and his wife and or concubines then become the model of the family to all of the rest of imperial China. And every household in China should follow the example of the royal family and what goes on behind the palace gates. So every man should be considered an emperor in his own home, and his wife should follow him dutifully, just as the empress follows the emperor. And then there were rules set out for how everyone shows up. And because those rules were established, everyone now had a portion of society that they could call their own. They knew how they were supposed to be and behave, but then they had something to aspire to as well, because Confucianism allowed for upward mobility. If a person could prove, a person, when I say a person, I mean a man, if a man could prove his worth or was willing to make certain sacrifices, he could climb the strata of society. A lowly farmer who has the brains and can study can take the imperial exam and potentially become someone who serves directly to the emperor, whether that's as a local magistrate or all the way up to becoming a judge and someone who metes out punishments across the land in the name of the emperor. Confucianism also dictated how men and women were to behave towards one another. After, I believe it is the age of, and don't quote me on this because I'm doing this from memory, but I believe it's after the age of 6 or 7, it might even be younger, fathers no longer interacted with their daughters because it would be considered improper, impure. Same thing with their older brothers. If a little girl is born into a family that has older brothers, then they were allowed to play with her and love on her until she reached a certain age, typically around when foot bindings happen. And then that's it. She has to go into the women's chambers. But it was the duty of the men to protect the women in their household, to make sure their daughter's purity was preserved, and then also to ensure that the women had what they needed for household things to happen. Women had their own portion of the house. Typically, the houses back then were 2-story. If you weren't poor, I mean, if you were super poor, you had a room if you were lucky. But if you weren't extra poor, typically the house would be in 2 stories. Bottom level is where household stuff was and men's stuff happened. So, the kitchen area was for women to do the kitchen stuff and whatnot. There might be the bedroom of the husband and wife on the first floor, but the upstairs chambers were strictly for women. Men did not go up there unless there was a big problem, like somebody's got to be carried to the hospital or something. But that closeted world would be where women would spend most of their time, learning from women who are older, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, sisters, aunties, moms, how a woman should behave in society. So Confucianism dictated that men had control of the world outside of the home, women had control of the world inside of the home. And that brings us to a level of understanding of where we are in this particular book. Now, a little bit more level setting. We've talked about foot binding before, which is also a central theme in this particular novel. And it's very easy to prejudge this practice. I don't want it done to me. Think it's barbaric. Shouldn't happen. But again, we have to evaluate text, and especially historical novels, historical fiction, autobiographies. You have to evaluate these things within the context of the society that they're written in. That's why understanding Confucianism is so central to understanding these novels. Snowflower and the Secret Fan and Lady Tan's Circle of Women have a lot in common. They're both set in Confucian China. And this is right after, China has become China. There's now a lineage of emperors, and everyone needs to know how they're supposed to show up in their role in society. So let's talk about foot binding. China's weird in its approach to women. That's the best way I can say that. I'm talking about historical China. I can't speak to it now. Don't do a lot of study on modern China. Probably should. We're just talking about ancient China. But it was a society that wanted boys. We all know that. I don't think that that's a surprise to anyone. And honestly, throughout most of the world, boy children were valued more than girl children. which never honestly made sense to me because you're not going to get a boy child unless a woman births him. If everyone's a boy, where are the girls going to come from? Anyhow, but I digress. So, this is a society that prizes boys. However, women have the ability to win their value in certain ways. One of those is through the process of foot binding. If a woman is in a household of sufficient status, and sufficient status can mean a farmer, she could be subject to the process of foot binding. In Confucian society, foot binding represented many things for a girl and a woman. Uh, and if you don't know what foot binding is, it is the practice of somewhere between the ages of 3 and 7, depending on what subculture you were from, binding girls' feet so tightly that they literally break in half and you reform them to a new shape. Like all your toes gonna break, the big bone in the top of your foot gonna break, and the goal is to get the foot to be about the length of a woman's thumb. Now I'm 6'1", so that never could have happened with me. But genetic isolation. Everybody kind of knew how tall everyone was going to be. Women were little at the time, but my thumb would have been considered too big. It would probably be more like the length of half my pinky that they'd be looking for. I've got long, sinewy fingers because I'm tall. But yeah, this is what they were going for. As a result of foot binding, it was a long, painful process. Took about a year to 2 years to fully accomplish. And it wasn't just the wrapping of the feet. The feet would be wrapped tighter and tighter and tighter every time bandages were undone. You had to watch for infection, and the girls actually had to walk on their feet until the breaking of the bones happened and the mother could twist the foot into its new position. That's horrific. The reason this was being done in Confucian China was the representation of what foot binding meant. One, let's all be real, a woman on bound feet can't run away. They're tottering on these little stumps that forces them to walk a certain way. So it was actually like a forced reserve way of being. Women were supposed to, I'm not going to say that. I was about to make a reference to that Mormon documentary that just came out, and I feel like I would get shouted at for that. You know the one. But women were supposed to be meek, be quiet, be reserved, never do anything to embarrass the family. And the goal of that foot binding produced a certain type of walk that made women in older Chinese gowns very alluring. That is actually the history of high heels. Western women saw the way those women walked and how their men were attracted to it, but they weren't willing to break their feet to get to that result. Thus, we have high heels, and we break our feet in different ways now. But that's where heels come from, to imitate that walk without having to break your foot, which personally, I much prefer heels. That was one thing. So a woman with broken feet can't run away. Let's be real. That's a big part of it. But then there was more to it. Again, we evaluate cultures and works from within the society that they are created. The next thing was it showed the obedience of the daughter. Because in order for foot binding to be successful, a girl had to be perfectly obedient to her mother, grandmother, other women in the household, a mother-in-law, whoever the other women were, in whatever order of hierarchy they existed in the house. Because those women have been through it, they've probably helped other girls and women go through it, so they know what to do. So you have to have that blind obedience to do it right, to produce a perfect foot, which would be called a golden lily if it turned out right. And those golden lilies could be a girl's key to a better future. Boys could study and work hard and increase their standing in society. A girl had to go through pain to improve her standing in society. Going through foot binding and it being successful would show a prospective family, especially the mother-in-law, that this would be an obedient daughter, that she would do what she was told in this household, and she would do it quietly without shouting, especially if her foot turned out perfect, because the more perfect your foot, the more it hurt to go through that process. So producing perfect golden lilies was the goal, because putting that pain on a child was a mother's love. The Chinese character for a mother's love actually includes the character for pain, because a mother loving her daughter, her children, is pain, because she has to hurt her daughter in order to get her to a better position in life, but she's also going to lose her daughter to another family one day. So there's also a culture of being more standoffish with girls because they call them useless branches of the family. When a girl is born into a household, she's automatically useless because she is going to produce sons for another household. They are raising her to marry her out, and the purpose of the bride price is actually for a family who's receiving the bride to pay back the natal family for raising her. And the dowry is supposed to belong to the bride should she ever be cast out or left on her own for any reason. Yeah, it gets deep. Beyond that, what foot binding also shows to the family is that this is a girl who can go through childbirth. I can't think of anything more painful than women's issues. All of them. That look, ladies. Let's just be real equal with each other. Whether it's the fibroid, the endometriosis, the adenomyosis, the childbirth, like anything that happens to women, there's pain involved. It's having a uterus is work. And it comes with a lot of pain. Some more pain for others than some people have easy childbirth. The baby falls out and they just go back. Their tummy is snatched the next day and they go back to it. I am proud of you. There are others who have the worst time ever, end up bedridden for 6 months of their pregnancy, and they can't hardly move. The baby's gonna fall out at the wrong moment. Having a woman's body is pain. But if a girl could make it through foot binding successfully and produce golden lilies, that showed the next family, this is a girl that we can keep putting babies in until we get sons. So, because she can handle the pain. Because you also have to remember, and we're going to get to that in this book, the theologies of treating women were very different than the theologies of treating men. And we'll get to that in the second half of this first chapter. I'm going to save that discussion for when I get to that portion of the book. But the way male doctors approached treating women was, I'll be honest, it was barbaric. It was absolutely barbaric. I'll give you a snippet of it now before we have that full discussion in the next time I do this book. But if a woman was ill and needed treatment for a doctor, it was improper for a man to have direct conversation with a woman that's not one of his women, whether it be a wife or a concubine. So the doctor would sit behind a screen or outside the room where the sick woman was, and there had to be a go-between, typically her husband, or if she had a daughter who was old enough, or another woman in the household, like a concubine or something, going back and forth in between, a lower-ranked woman, basically, but hopefully the husband. And the doctor would say, does the patient feel blah, 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 blah? And then that person has to remember that question exactly, go to the patient, the woman, and say, hey, doctors want to know blah, 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 blah. And woman answers and runs back. And it's a back and forth, just the worst game of telephone ever. And the doctor would make a pronouncement of something dumb like, oh, well, you know what? She has too much passion. So treat her more poorly, and then maybe she won't be in such a bad mood. That was a little bit of a glib explanation, but in some of these passages that feels like exactly what happened. Because the men's philosophy of treating women was that everything that happened to a woman came down to her emotions. So that's the world that we're walking into, and that's the world that our central character in this book, the eventual Lady Tan Yunjian, is born into. She's born into a world where she's expected to behave a certain way, where as a young child, her mother broke her feet in order to potentially give her a better future. She is born into a world where medicine is the world of men exclusively. And anything that's wrong with a woman, if a man does not fully understand women and their ailments, then they're not going to be treated well, or they're going to get improper treatment. This is a world where giving birth meant you had to stand up. Yeah, I said stand up because C-sections weren't a thing yet. Well, they were actually, but yeah, that's a whole other horrible business. But a woman had to stand up and hold on to a rope over a bucket and some straw as her baby just basically That's the world we're in. Not that it wasn't effective, because I mean, when you produce a population of 1 billion people, you're doing something right in the birthing process. But treating women was utterly barbaric. Even the empress of the country wasn't too important as to not be subject to the same things. The imperial doctors would still look at her as just another woman, even though she's going to potentially give birth to the heir of the nation. And that's where the work of Lady Tan and other women like her becomes so important. So I actually read all the jacket stuff. There's a lot of post information in this book once you get to the end of it. In the acknowledgments, you definitely want to read the acknowledgments in this book, because it takes you through the history of how Lisa See came to this novel. She actually ended up reading some of the works that were written by Lady Tan, and then getting in contact with one of her descendants who was able to give her more information. And unfortunately, I believe the descendant who gave her all that info, if I'm remembering from the acknowledgments, passed away before the book was published. But she had a direct line backwards to uncovering the family of this female doctor. And female doctors exclusively treated women back then. And there's a lot of discourse we're going to talk about in the second half of the first chapter. But it's really interesting that they even had a system that would allow a woman to be a doctor. Lady Tan is very fortunate that she is born into a family where a female doctor already exists, who is married to a male doctor, and her grandmother, who is the female doctor, actually comes from a long line of doctors. So it was normal in her household. And she eventually gets the ability and permission to study under her grandmother, and has the ability to save countless lives of women through her knowledge. Because how can you treat someone that you can't even go look at? Like, I just went through a really big surgery. I actually have my follow-up appointment today. And my doctor's a woman, and I'm sitting across from her. She's asking me, how I'm feeling, symptoms, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, because I just read this book, and I'm thinking, how could she treat me? How could she know what to do for me if she can't see me, examine me, take my pulse, take my temperature, be able to do all of those things? How could a man, just through a series of questions, determine what's completely wrong? And then, because men and women biologically are so different, especially at a time when there's no x-ray machines, there's no MRIs, there's no blood tests, without him having the experience of being in the women's chambers, of having monthly moon water, that's what they call it now in that book, without having the experience of monthly moon water and the rest of it, how could he possibly know what some of the ailments that women can suffer from are, and how to properly treat them? And that's where Lady Tan begins to develop a circle of women, and they love and protect each other and figure out a way of how can we keep women from suffering from the ignorance of men. And that is just the best way I can say that. So let's not delay any further. Let's get into the first part of chapter 1. Lady Tan's Circle of Women by Lisa See. Part 1. Milk Days. The 5th year of the Qinghua Emperor's reign. 1469. To live is 1,000 years in the past, 1,000 years in the future. No matter where you live or how rich or poor you are, the 4 phases of a woman's life are the same. Respectful Lady says, you are a little girl, so you are still in milk days. When you turn 15, you will enter hair pinning days. The way we style our hair will announce to the world that you are ready for marriage. She smiles at me. Tell me, daughter, what comes next? Rice and salt days, I answered dutifully, but my mind wanders. My mother and I sit together on porcelain stools under a covered colonnade in our home's courtyard. It's monsoon season, so the sliver of sky I can see is heavy with clouds, making the air feel humid, suffocating. Other containers hold cibidums, their stalks drooping under the weight of the blossoms. Rain is coming. But until then, birds titter in the ginkgo tree that provides a touch of coolness on a summer day. And I can smell the sea, something I've only seen in paintings. The fragrance doesn't, however, cover the unpleasant odor coming from respectful ladies' bound feet. Your thoughts are elsewhere. Her voice sounds frail as her body looks. You must pay attention. She reaches over and takes one of my hands. Are you having pain today? When I nod, she says, the memories of the agony you felt during your foot binding will never leave completely. There will be days from now until you die when the anguish will visit. If you've stood too long or walked too long, if the weather is about to change, if you don't take proper care of your feet. She squeezes my hand sympathetically. When they throb or smart, remind yourself that one day your suffering will be proof to your husband of your love. Focusing on something else will distract you from the pain. My mother is wise, which is why everyone in the household, including my brother Yi Feng and I, call her respectful lady, the honorary title she carries as the wife of someone with my father's high rank. But if she can tell I'm distracted, then I can see she is too. The sound of a woman singing reaches us. Miss Zhao, my father's concubine, must be entertaining my father and his guests. You know how to concentrate when you want to. My mother goes on at last. This ability to be fully absorbed is what saves us. She pauses for a moment as male laughter, my father's voice distinct in appreciative choir, swirls around us like a fog. She then asks, shall we continue? I take a breath. Rice and salt days are the most important years in a woman's life. They are when I will be busy with wife and mother duties, as I am now. Respectful lady gracefully tips her head, setting the gold and jade ornaments that hang from her bun into tinkling softly. How pale she is. How elegant. Each day should begin early. I rise before dawn, cleanse my face, rinse my mouth with fragrant tea, attend to my feet, and fix my hair and makeup. Then I go to the kitchen to make sure the servants have lit the fire and begun the morning meal. She releases my hand and sighs, as though exhausted by the effort of getting so many words to leave her mouth. She takes a deep breath before continuing. Memorizing these responsibilities is central to your education, but you can also learn by observing as I supervise the chores that must be done each day. Bringing in fuel and water, sending a big-footed servant girl to the market, making sure clothes, including those of Miss Zhao, are washed, and so many other things that are essential to managing the household. Now, what else? She's been teaching me like this for 4 years already, and I know the answer she likes me to give. Learning to embroider, play the zither, and memorize sayings from Intellects for Women and other text too, so that by the time you go to your husband's home, you will have an understanding of all you must do and all you must avoid. She shifts on her stool. Eventually, you will reach the time of sitting quietly. Do you know what this means? Maybe it's because I'm feeling physical pain, but the thought of the sadness and loneliness of sitting quietly causes tears to well in my eyes. This will come when I can no longer bear children, and extends into widowhood. You will be the one who has not died, waiting for death to reunite you with your husband. A maid arrives with a tray of snacks, so my mother and I can continue our studies through lunch without a break. 2 hours later, respectful lady asked me to repeat the rules we've covered. When walking, I don't turn my head, I recite without protest. When talking, don't open my mouth wide. When standing, don't rustle my skirts. When happy, don't rejoice with loud laughter. When angry, never raise my voice. I will bury all desire to venture beyond the inner chambers. Those rooms are for women alone. Very good. Respectful lady praises me. Always remember your place in the world. If you follow these rules, you will establish yourself as a true and proper human being. She closes her eyes. She's hurting too. Only she's too much of a lady to speak of it. A squeal from my little brother interrupts our shared moment. Yi Feng runs across the courtyard. His mother, Miss Zhao, free of her performing duties, glides behind him. Her feet are also bound, and her steps are so small they give the impression she's floating like a ghost. My mother whispers as though she's read my thoughts. Yi Feng flings himself at my mother, buries his face in her lap, and giggles. Miss Zhao may be his birth mother, but respectful lady not only is his ritual mother, but has formally adopted him as her son. This means Yi Feng will make offerings and perform all rites and ceremonies after my mother and our father become ancestors in the afterworld. My mother pulls Yi Feng onto her lap, brushing the bottoms of his shoes so that no leaves or dirt get on her silk gown. That is all, Miss Zhao. Respectful lady. The concubine gives a polite nod and then quietly slips out of the courtyard. My mother turns to the afternoon's teaching session, which Yi Feng and I share. We will spend each day learning together until he reaches his 7th year, when the Book of Rites orders that boys and girls should not sit at the same mat or eat at the same table. At that time, Yi Feng will leave our company and move to the library to spend his hours with private tutors in preparation to take imperial exams. Harmony should be maintained in a household, but everyone knows how hard this is. Respectful lady begins. After all, the written character for trouble is composed of the character for roof with the characters for 2 women under it, while the character of 1 woman under a roof means peace. I answer, good. A pig under a roof means prison. There is no written character with a man under a roof. Whether animal or woman, we are a man's possessions. We women exist to give him heirs and feed, clothe, and amuse him. Never forget that. While my brother and I recite simple poems, I work on my embroidery. I hope I'm successful at hiding my disappointment. I know Miss Zhao wasn't the only one entertaining my father and his friends. Yi Feng was also being shown off. Now, when he forgets a line, respectful lady glances at me to complete it for him. In this way, I'm learning what he's learning too. I'm older, so I'm much better at memorizing. I'm good at using words and images from poems in my thoughts when I talk. Today, though, I stumble on a line, and Respectful Lady purses her lips. You will not take the imperial exams or become a scholar like your brother, she points out. But one day you will be the mother of sons. To help them in their future studies, you must learn now. It stings to disappoint her. On a good day, I can recite poems from the Book of Odes and read aloud from the classic of filial piety for girls. Today is not one of those days. In the late afternoon, my mother announces it's time to move to the studio. Yifeng and I follow Respectful Lady at a proper distance. The folds of her gown billow, and her sleeves are picked up on the breeze, just like in a painting. The air moves in and out enough that we are awash in the odor that comes from her bound feet. A special aroma that will eventually come from my own feet. My mother likes to remind me when I cry during my binding, and it will fascinate my husband. Today, the scent from my mother's feet is far from pleasing. I swallow hard as a wave of nausea washes through me. I have no memories of ever being outside of our compound, and I may not pass through the main gate until I'm in my hairpinning days and am taken to my husband's home in marriage. But I don't care. I love our home, especially the studio, with its whitewashed walls, simple furniture, and shelves filled with books and hand scrolls. My mother sits on one side of the table. My brother and I sit across from her. My mother watches as I grind the ink on the inkstone and mix it in water to achieve a perfect density and blackness. I hold my brush in one hand, and with my other, I pull my sleeve back so it won't get stained. Respectful Lady has said that each calligraphy stroke must be fluid, yet bold. Beside me, Yifeng tries his best, but his characters are wobbly. Checking his work causes me to make my second mistake of the day. Instead of my stroke thinning at the end of an eyebrow, I make a blot on the paper. I lift the brush but keep my face down, staring at the mess I've made and waiting for my mother to say something. The silence continues, and I glance up. She gazes out the window, oblivious to me, my mistake, or Yifeng's wiggling. When she's like this, we know she's thinking about my two older brothers, who died on the same day 5 years ago from heavenly flower disease, smallpox. If they'd survived, they would have been 10 and 12 years old. And if they'd lived, my father might not have brought in Miss Zhao, and I wouldn't have Yifeng as my younger brother, and my mother wouldn't have a ritual son. My maid Poppy enters, and Respectful Lady gives a small nod. Without inspecting my work, she says, "That's enough for today. Poppy, please have the children change and then bring them to the library to see their father." Poppy takes my brother to Miss Zhao, and then the two of us continue to my room. Father bought Poppy for me on the occasion of my birth. She's 15 with big feet. Her eyes are set wide on her face, and she has an obedient disposition. She sleeps on the floor at the foot of my bed and many times has comforted me when I've awakened by a nightmare. She helps me to dress, wash, and eat. I don't know where Poppy comes from, but she'll be part of my dowry, which means we'll be together until whichever one of us dies first. Having sat nearly all day, I'm antsy, but Poppy will have none of it. "Yu Zhan, you're worse than your brother," she scolds. "Stand still so I can brush your hair." "But," she holds up a finger. "No." She gives me a stern look, but it quickly turns to a grin. She spoils me, it's true. "So, tell me what you learned today." I do my best reciting the usual things. "When I marry, I will respectfully serve my father-in-law. I will not look at him when he speaks to me. I will not address him, ever. I will listen and obey." Poppy noisily sucks her teeth to let me know she approves. In my mind, I'm chewing on something Respectful Lady said earlier. Always remember your place in the world. I was born into the Tan family. My given name is Yun Jian, which means loyal virtue. Medicine has been in my family for generations, but my father chose a different path. He's an imperial scholar of the Juren level, a recommended man, who has passed the provincial exams. He worked as a prefect here in Lijiao, which is close to the ocean, but hundreds of li from our family's ancestral home in Wuji. For longer than my lifetime, he's been studying to take the next highest level of imperial examinations, which takes place every 3 years. The geomancer has already chosen a date for father to travel to the capital, where he'll complete his final studies before testing begins. If he succeeds, the emperor himself will read my father's essay and announce that he's achieved the level of Jinshi Scholar, a presented scholar, and award him his title. I don't know how our lives will change if that happens, except that our family will have taken another step on the ladder of life. What else can I say about my place in the world? I'm 8 years old. Young enough that I still wear my hair in black ribbons. Respectful Lady has told me that my complexion is as fine as the flesh of a white peach. But that can't be true, since she has Poppy apply ointments to the 3 pock marks, 1 high on my forehead and 2 side by side on my right cheek. They are visible reminders that I survived smallpox while my brothers didn't. My feet make up for these defects. They are perfect. Today I wear a pair of silk slippers embroidered by my mother with flowers and bats for good luck. Poppy nudges me. And your relations with your future mother-in-law? Yes, yes, I say, snapping back. When she sits, I will remain standing. I will rise early, but I won't make any noise that could disturb her sleep. I will prepare and serve her tea. Pappy pats my bottom, satisfied that I'm ready to be presented to my father. That's enough. Let's hurry now. We don't want to upset the master. We retrace our steps, picking up Yifeng from the rooms he shares with Miss Zhao. The 3 of us walk hand in hand. The rain has finally started, but we're protected by a colonnade. The drops hitting the tile roof sound comforting, and already the air feels cleaner, lighter, as the humidity is washed out of it. In the library, my parents sit next to each other in simply carved chairs. An altar table rests against the white wall behind them. A summer orchid blooms from a blonde pot. Respectful Lady's hands lie folded in her lap. Her feet are propped on a brocade footrest, and her slippers, as small as my own, peek out from under her gown. Respectful Lady is always pale, but today her skin appears almost translucent. A light sheen of sweat glistens on her forehead and upper lip. My father seems unaffected by the odor coming from my mother's feet. He sits with his legs spread and his hands on his thighs so his fingers point inward as his thumbs rest outward. He wears the long, layered robes of his rank. The sleeve guards that edge the hems of his tunic are heavily embroidered. A mandarin square, also embroidered, covers his chest and tells all who see him his grade within the imperial system of civil servants. He motions for Yifeng to come for him. Poppy drops his hand and Yifeng darts across the floor and jumps into our father's lap. I would never do that. I lost the ability to run when my feet were bound. But even if I could run, it would be inappropriate for me to act so recklessly. My father laughs. My mother smiles. Poppy squeezes my hand reassuringly. That's enough for now. It's amazing how much Lisa C. tells you about this society in 8 pages. That was just a few pages of the first chapter. We'll finish the first chapter, but I'm not going to go much further into her book because you need to read this. It's that great. Especially as a woman, I know some of the lines in the storytelling can be disturbing. Lines like, we're property. That was just the way the society worked then. Everything that a man collected under his roof, including women, servants, animals, they were all property of that man. And the greater a man climbed in his status, the more of those things he was allowed to have. So a poor man might only ever have one wife and his children, because only a man who could afford it could have a concubine. And even though, now I want to say this the right way, even though men were allowed to have concubines, not all of them did. According to the history that this book is based on, the emperor at the time only ever had one wife. He didn't take concubines, even though emperors were well known to have hundreds, sometimes thousands of women at their disposal. There was no imperial harem at this time, which wasn't well known outside of the gates of the imperial palace. As I read this book, just because a man could doesn't mean he had to. It wasn't a requirement for life. And even the observation of our central character, young Lady Tan, before she becomes Lady Tan, Yu Jian, she even understands that had the two sons her mother had lived, her father may never have gotten a concubine. Because unfortunately in this society, once a woman hits about 30, 29, 30 years old, they're kind of done with them. So had he had his two sons that lived, he wouldn't have gotten a concubine, because the purpose of the concubine basically was to bring sons. And she did. And he was kind of done with her at that point once he got his son. But more things are going to happen. But it's important to respect the history so that you can understand. Because when you get into a novel like this, it's imperative to not be angry at the central character. She is a product of the society that she's born into, just as you and I are. We didn't get to choose when and where we were born. I've said it many times on this channel when looking at books like this and works of historical fiction. I feel very fortunate that I got to be a modern black female in this day and age, and I wasn't born 100 years ago, 200 years ago, because my place in society, whether it was on this side of the ocean or the other, would have been very different. I like the place in society I have now. These women didn't choose this, even though we want to say, why would her mother teach her such things? Why would respectful lady tell her daughter, you're a man's property? She knows the world that she's born into. She had a mother-in-law. She was a daughter who grew up as a useless branch to have her feet bound, and then be given away to another family with the purpose in mind that she'd produce sons. She knows that in the world she lives in, this is what her daughter must do, must be, in order to secure her place in the world and not be thrown into the streets one day like a big-footed girl. And if you wonder what big-footed girl means, it means girl with unbound feet. Those women are considered unfit to marry. The best they can be are, I'm not going to say that, but they can be servants, and read between the lines in my eyes. So that's where we're going to pause it today. I hope you enjoyed that. Really love this. I hope that was enough for you to go out and buy the book and invest in reading it. We'll pick up in the second half of chapter 1 a little bit later. But until then, thank you so much for joining me for this, and I will see you in the next one.